Hola Pulpo, saludos Pulpo. Oh, sure.
Thank you Martha, RCO68 for joining. Thank you Caro Lovelace for joining. Thank you Iastazel for joining. Thank you Serum 1974 for joining. Thank you Rudy Gonzalez 362 for joining. Thank you Fahabanita 1 for joining. Thank you Taracuco for joining. Thank you Lydia Coronado 656 for joining. Thank you Dulce Rivera 8066 for joining. Thank you Antipalazio 47 for joining. Thank you Rosalina Barajas 21 for joining. Thank you M8M7 for joining. Thank you Vera Diana Kirosna for joining. Thank you Javier Gardela for joining. Thank you Analilia 5492 for joining. Thank you Esperanza MG66 for joining. Thank you Tomasa Santana 3 for joining. Thank you Imbaraza 70 for joining. Thank you Biba Bebasoda for joining. Thank you Malicia Meza for joining. Thank you Irene Gutierrez 2 for joining. Thank you Emiteria Rojas for joining. Thank you Rosie Moran 2 for joining. Thank you Maria Nielsen 812 for joining. Thank you Tall Girl 6234 for joining. Thank you Amino 2589 for joining. Thank you Veronica Corte for joining. Thank you Agustina Martin 15 for joining. Thank you Eloisa Sanchez 59 for joining. Thank you Sandrad 410 for joining. Thank you Urs 926 for joining. Thank you Philippidias Diaz 4 for joining. Thank you Hotaru 7767 for joining. Thank you Anaveras Emociones for joining. Thank you 25 Chris Ortega for joining. Thank you Iris Monteroso 653 for joining. Thank you Adriana Bautista 534 for joining. Thank you Pedro Marquez 2789 for joining. Thank you Lulilio 61 for joining. Thank you Tifliti for joining. Thank you Carlos Juan 3481 for joining. Thank you Miriam Maya 5 for joining. Thank you Lisarim Martinez 74 for joining. Thank you Vicky Ortiz 146 for joining. Thank you Josvalela 08 for joining. Thank you Cruz Margarita 739 for joining. Thank you Vicky Torres 626 for joining. Thank you Kevs 250 for joining. Thank you JZM Balloons and more for joining. Thank you Malucio 824 for joining. Thank you Nozo24 for joining. Thank you Maria Rivera 8280 for joining. Thank you Reina Yadira Urquiz for joining. Thank you Olga Alvarez 148 for joining. Thank you Uno 1046 for joining. Thank you Laura Atenko for joining. Thank you Janet Hughes 478 for joining. Thank you Norma Flores 8800 for joining. Thank you Cantalano 21 for joining. Thank you Samantha B. Delian for joining. Thank you Chul 153 for joining. Thank you Maria Esther Rotter 323 for joining. Thank you Io Mariflores 655 for joining. Thank you Rosie Perez Morald for joining. Thank you Teresa Chavez 813 for joining. Thank you Frylick for joining. Thank you May 2652 for joining. Thank you Eve, Castillo 45 for joining. Thank you Carmen Beltran.1 for joining. Thank you Ophelia Martinez, C5 for joining. Thank you ThickDip 101 for joining. Thank you Eloisa Flores 2 for joining. Thank you Ala Flores 68 for joining. Thank you Beatrice Gonzalez 8 for joining. Thank you Marina Maldonado 550 for joining. Thank you Dalia Ramirez 133 for joining. Thank you Maria Castro 5855 for joining. Thank you Alia Campo 8 for joining. Thank you Rizal Batristain for joining. Thank you Donna Holly Burton W for joining. Thank you Luisa Velez 73 for joining. Thank you Jasmine Aguilar for joining. Thank you Carnathan for joining. Thank you Athena Unicorn 26 for joining. Thank you Elena Herrera 3768 for joining. Thank you Linda Wilborn 528 for joining. Thank you Lords Peña 4 for joining. Thank you Victoria Marrero 7 for joining. Thank you Mr. Creations 00 for joining. Thank you DYFV4CZ05HWP Mamacita for joining. Thank you Millie Sandoval for joining. Thank you Myra Rodriguez 9540 for joining. Thank you Elva Maria 1942 for joining. Thank you Patricia Hernandez 1801 for joining. Thank you A4148 for joining. Thank you Yhockey for joining. Thank you Marizavalejo 181 for joining. Thank you Yolanda Hernandez 489 for joining. Thank you Mommy 1193 for joining. Thank you Luisa Ramirez.438 for joining.
What? Yeah, I found it in that box when I was looking for another thing. I'll call Maria first thing in the morning.
Thank you Laura Susie 3 for joining. Thank you Alonzo Martinez 30 for joining. Thank you Mariazuri 1001 for joining. Thank you Burby Donnie for joining. Thank you Barrera 51 for joining. Thank you Licha 334 for joining. Thank you Moya 1231 for joining. Thank you Stanley 7414 for joining. Thank you Zero Beholder for joining. Thank you Lazalway 4 for joining. Thank you Realins.Ica for joining. Thank you the one never the two for joining. Thank you Yesenia Gamero 708 for joining. Thank you Elio Fuentes 7 for joining. Thank you Teresa Cortez 2961 for joining. Thank you Blanca Renaga 1 for joining. Thank you Francia Brilcita for joining. Thank you Claudia Treviso 090 for joining. Thank you Jacqueline Velezgo for joining. Thank you Betty Ortiz 223 for joining. Thank you Juana Aguilar 1427 for joining. Thank you Zoyalau 1965 for joining. Thank you Gloria Garcia 680 for joining. Thank you Grossource 5Y for joining. Thank you Don Kinsey 07 for joining. Thank you the Edster 0 for joining. Thank you Ramona Crane 6 for joining. Thank you Eusebia 015 for joining. Thank you Ana Maria Guadalupe 17 for joining. Thank you 1C1T0 for joining. Thank you Mrs. Torresales for joining. Thank you Sebastian 1147 for joining. Thank you Francisca Luna 563 for joining. Thank you Travisayu for joining. Aztequita porque eres tan coquito! Exclamation mark. Thank you Maravia8786 for joining. Thank you Jazz0384 for joining. Thank you Sylvia Hinojosa 935 for joining.
Stop, I don't want your mind. TikTok.
Thank you Alicia Tejeda 933 for joining. Thank you Tide 1239 for joining. Thank you Patracastillo 3 for joining. Thank you Ramid 2 for joining. Thank you Claudia Medina 83 for joining. Thank you Fellet Compa for joining. Thank you DS7275 for joining. Thank you Zulema Harada for joining. Thank you Estefani Morales 115 for joining. Thank you Edna 43 for joining. Thank you M Handard for joining. Thank you Juan Egbu Sixes for joining. Thank you Selena Martinez 82 for joining. Thank you La Preciosa 49 for joining. Thank you Vallejo 93 for joining.